A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, we're back talking biblical perspectives on government today, leading up to the federal election. Andrew McColl is the Family Voice Australia State Director for the state of Queensland. Andrew McColl, a special welcome back to 2020.
Good morning, Neil, and good morning, listeners today.
Hey, Andrew, getting a start in this conversation, and we've been talking about this almost like a serial, and listeners can listen to earlier podcasts because the sorts of things you're talking about, nobody else is talking about these. But let's start with, what political commentators around the nation are saying about this upcoming election. What have you been monitoring? What have you noticed? Is there any common threads?
Well, there are some common threads, Neil, and I picked up from Chris Richardson in The Australian on the 14th of this month. He says, it's pathetic. This is the best that the two major parties in Australia can serve up to us. All it does is confirm that they've got their heads buried firmly in the sand. Paul Kelly wrote in The Australian also on the 14th, the fusion of an election, inflation and a housing crisis has taken Australian public policy to a dismal low. The public, to a large extent, is being offered phony and glib answers to its cost of living grief. And then Matthew Cranston, also in The Australian on the 15th of April, says, forget political parties doing the economically and fiscally responsible thing with housing in Australia. That went out the window long ago.
Okay, you've got these thoughts. It's pathetic, phony and glib answers to the cost of living grief that so many, even listening to our program today, are right in the middle of. These are challenging times, and you've been reflecting on the fact that we've got to learn a few lessons, because if you don't take seriously where the values are in your politics, you're headed for a level of destruction. So what have we got to learn?
Well, we have to learn, Neil, that the record of Western governments for over a century now hasn't been a positive one. Now, why is this? Well, the socialists' promises have always been alluring but elusive. Firstly, because the socialist is a practical atheist. He doesn't believe in God and doesn't think there's any need to give any room to the thought of God and his word and his purpose in the personal life, in the community life, in the nation. Secondly, he doesn't respect or understand the vital role of the individual, the family and the church in the broader community. He sees the community like a massive bowl of mashed potato to be controlled and predestined by the power of the state, not the power of God. Now, conservatives sometimes understand this. It was Henry Ford who wrote that any man who thinks he can be happy and prosperous by letting the government take care of him better take a closer look at the American Indian. Thomas Sowell claimed that if you have been voting for politicians who promise to give you goodies at someone else's expense, then you have no right to complain when they take your money and give it to someone else, including themselves. President Reagan 40 years ago said, government that is big enough to give you everything you want is more likely to simply take everything you've got.
Okay. Hey, let me just draw attention to a couple of thoughts you've just delivered. A socialist is a practical atheist, and there is a sense, some are saying that both sides of politics here in Australia lean towards socialism because they're divorcing faith from any of the political debate. That might be an obvious thing. And just to look at both sides and say, well, okay, well, they're both lean left, even though there's one claims to be sort of centre right. And then you use this terminology, seeing the community like a massive bowl of mashed potato. All right, I'm just imagining now the potato masher and mashing it all together and hoping I've got something coming out of that might look right. Hey, what's the solution then? If this is such a socialist-leaning political theatre that we have in Australia, where do we look for solutions?
Well, thankfully, Neil, the Bible gives us an entirely different picture. The community is not a big bowl of mashed potato. God sees us firstly as individuals called to know him and his word. Along with that, we marry, have children, participate in church, and have influence in the workplace and the broader community. The family and the church are important institutions of governance to God, just as the state is. The Bible encourages us to trust in God's predestination, not grandiose government plans that have the habit of proving futile and falling to pieces. The Bible explains that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And these whom he called, he also justified. And these whom he justified, he also glorified. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who is against us? That's from Romans chapter 8, verses 28 to 31. Now we know that Scripture warns us often about expecting too much from government. There are many such scriptural warnings, such as, like a roaring lion and a rushing bear is a wicked ruler over a poor people. A leader who is a great oppressor lacks understanding, but he who hates unjust gain will prolong his days. That's Proverbs chapter 28, verses 15 and 16. Judges chapter 9 includes a parable devoted to explaining what happens when foolish people choose the wrong kind of government. And we find in that chapter of Judges, chapter 9, the story of the bramble in verse 15, who they choose to lead them. On the contrary, good government requires a biblical knowledge of the human heart and great restraint. The Christian understands that the Bible places obligations upon us in relation to ourselves, our family, the church, and the community. For we're instructed to love your neighbour, just as Jesus explained in his parable of the Good Samaritan. This man had important resources: a compassionate heart, time, bandages, wine, and oil, a donkey, and money to pay the innkeeper. And you know what, Neil? He didn't seek government help. He took initiative. He showed personal responsibility for his neighbour, a man in great need. Jesus made it clear the Good Samaritan was a great neighbour.
And we don't often think of the Good Samaritan in a political context, but here's an example of helping your neighbour without the expectation of the government being the one who jumps in there and provides a free hospital bed, or whatever that might mean. Hey, where do we look for examples around these sorts of things?
Well, there have been conservative politicians who knew something about this, who'd seen how essential it is to have a clear view of what government can and should do, and how it should restrain itself from the foolish, the futile, and the unsustainable. Before she was elected Prime Minister of Britain, Margaret Thatcher wrote in Pathways to Power, "I have learned something of the failures and mistakes of the past, for the Conservatives only won a single election out of 5 between 1964 and 1974. She said, there is widespread feeling in the country that the Conservative Party has not defended conservative ideals explicitly and toughly enough, so that Britain is set on a course towards inevitable socialist mediocrity. That course must not only be halted, it must be reversed. In office, we allowed ourselves to become detached from many who had given us their support and trust. So Margaret Thatcher wasn't a socialist. She was a lay preacher's daughter. She was a believer in Jesus and a political conservative who understood the necessity for small government, less tax, and more freedom. Now, this applies to individuals, to families, to the church, to businesses and the nation, not just to survive, but to thrive. Margaret Thatcher had an ideological base for her conservative politics, and I would say based in Christianity. That's what set her apart, and that's what made her special. And isn't her diagnosis of conservatives in Britain 50 years ago relevant for them and our own political conservatives today who are trying hard to win without embracing or explaining a properly considered spiritual and ideological framework? That will be a direct and dangerous threat to the socialists, and that's what would really trouble them. As one political conservative has remarked, it's only when the Liberals are led by conservatives that they win by landslides.
It's challenging, isn't it, to think that the parties that we might think of as conservative are not quite so conservative after all. And when you reflect on Margaret Thatcher and her comment about inevitable socialist mediocrity, so if you refuse to embrace that classical conservatism that has its roots in Christianity, you are almost inevitably socialist mediocrity is where you're headed. How do we draw some loose ends together in talking about these things? Where to from here, Andrew?
Well, Neil, I'm not a baker or a cook, but I do know that no one can bake a cake without the necessary ingredients. It doesn't work that way. And no one can hope to take ground from under the socialists without a firm ideological basis to do so. God and his word provide the believer with what he needs to go the journey, whatever their sphere of life is. And that includes politics and government, which the Bible says so much to us about. So on the 3rd of May, when we go to vote in Australia, let me encourage listeners to vote according to their godly conscience and conservatism. Pro-life, less government, less tax, and more freedom. For as Jesus promised us, if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed.
You know, oftentimes people will say to me, you know, you need to separate your Christianity from politics. But then the immediate response has to be, well, God is king. We're in a kingdom. Jesus came preaching the kingdom, and kingdom is a political structure in itself. So the whole of, when we talk about our Christianity, or Judeo-Christianity and kingdom, there's a political engagement that is absolutely necessary. Hey, let's just talk about, let me explore a few things with you personally here, Andrew McColl, because great study gone into all of these sorts of things. Where we stand right at the moment, it is very highly likely that there will be a Labor minority with a Greens, Teals power sharing arrangement after the election. That's what all the pundits, that's what the commentators are saying, that's what the polls seem to be suggesting. And it's suggesting that Peter Dutton is not sufficiently conservative to be the alternative that you're talking about. Give us a little personal insight here, because we look like we're heading for a Labor minority with a power sharing deal with the Greens.
Well, that could very well happen, Neil. I'm cautious about making predictions 9 days out from the election because things happen. It is true that there is no great swing to the coalition. It's obvious. The Labor Party seems to be pretty much standing their ground. They haven't got much of a majority, only 3 seats in the parliament. More than they need. Once those 3 seats are gone, they're back to square. They've only got half. So after that, well, it gets messy. But as you say, it's got a strong chance that there will be some kind of Labor-Green minority government, and that may take us back something to the days of Julia Gillard, who couldn't herself get a wholesome Labor majority, so she was always going to be incumbent or required to use those 3 independents that she managed to find, and those were not particularly good days for Australia. And it's worth noting it was straight after that. Tony Abbott, a pretty conservative guy, bingo, a strong swing back to the coalition.
I think it's pretty clear, you and I, in conversations like this, happy to put the boot in both sides when it comes to a contrast to what we see as a level of biblical values. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that if there's a Labor-Greens power-sharing arrangement, that the Greens are likely to drag the Labor Party even further left. We'd say the Greens would be an extreme case, but that would drag the Labor Party left. There's the other scenario, possibilities of parties like One Nation and Family First that may well be a part of a sharing agreement on the Conservative side, on the Liberal National side. Is there something in the minor parties that you might have been thinking about that might be very important?
Well, I think so, because the upper house is where the minor parties tend to get much more of an opportunity. And I think there has definitely been a segment of the community that is pretty disillusioned with the Liberals, but definitely doesn't want to go towards the Labor or the Greens. So yes, it is true that the upper house, yes, but I think in terms of forming government, that's where the Conservatives may struggle, if we can call them Conservatives, may struggle to actually do much, because we tend to find that One Nation, for instance, has representation in the upper house. Family First is seeking it. Well, they are running candidates in the lower house too, but I think their biggest chance is going to be in the upper house. And so those parties, One Nation, Family First, the Libertarians are also running there. They've got some useful comments to make. So, but I think that you're going to find that the upper house is where we're going to get some potential, Neil, for some decent Conservative pressure to be brought.
Okay, and I know that the likes of Family First are working very hard to convince the electorate that they deserve a place on that crossbench in the Senate, and I know that some listeners will be quite attentive to that. How do you think Christians prepare for what it means when the policies become increasingly anti-Christian on both sides? I mean, this is the way that we often will talk about how you navigate going forward as a Christian, because things are changing so dramatically. What do you think Christians do to prepare?
Well, we should know what people want. We should know something about the policies of the parties, and it's evident that there is not a strong pro-life position at all coming from either the Labor Party or the Conservatives. I mean, they call themselves Conservatives, but the Liberal Party sit on the fence. They're not going to do anything about abortion. They say they permit a conscience vote. Well, yes, they do, but gee, I'm pretty unimpressed by that, to be honest with you, Neil. It doesn't mean much. It does mean, okay, so the individual is free to vote according to conscience. Well, that's great. But meanwhile, back at the ranch, what does it mean in terms of the politics of the country? Not much. We do need people in government who are prepared to stand for the things I just spoke about: pro-life, less government, less tax and more freedom. And very often it's the Christian people who understand that, just like Margaret Thatcher did, more than anybody else.
Well, we are drawing close to that election, and good insights, as always, Andrew McColl, around government as we lead up to a federal election. Andrew McColl is the Family Voice Australia State Director for the state of Queensland. familyvoice.org.au to connect with Andrew McColl. familyvoice.org.au. And Andrew, any resources, just very quickly, coming from Family Voice with the lead up to the federal election that you can draw attention to? Are there anything on the website listeners could access?
Well, we do have some Zoom sessions that I've done with various people in the last few weeks, Lyle Shelton being one of them. He was very good. So it's important to look around and find what you can. But once again, I would encourage Christian people, vote by your convictions. Let your convictions drive you to the political choices that you make. Then you'll be free. I've voted according to my conscience. I've done what I think is the right thing to do, and that's how it's going to be. Now, if that means that we have a Labor Green coalition, that's what we have to deal with. I would say that Australia may need that. It might be a good dose of painful medicine that we need to understand and face up to, so that next time the nation will have learned something from a painful experience.
Andrew McColl, thank you so much for your update with us today. familyvoice.org.au. We'll talk again soon, Andrew.
Always a pleasure, Neil. Thank you.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.